Good evening. Welcome to Season 2 of Musing, a storytelling series. Thank you very much. My name is Seth, and I'm the curator for Musing, and tonight we're very excited to bring you a fresh installment of true stories as remembered, told by the people who lived them. Each of our storytellers tonight pitched their story via email. Then they had 4 workshopping rehearsals, all in preparation for this very moment. And I think you're in for a real treat. As you know, past Musing events have each had their own theme, but this season we're going to try something new. Each of our events will cover a variety of themes. You can sort of think of them as grab bags or old-fashioned mixtapes. The stories you're about to hear are sure to touch your heart, make you laugh, and maybe even inspire you to tell your story. And before I introduce our first storyteller, will you all just please make sure your cell phones are on silent or even powered off? Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Now, you may recognize our first storyteller from last season's event, Life and Death. He is the Vice President of People and Training for Lutheran Family Services. He also serves on the board of the Alzheimer's Association of Nebraska, as well as the ACLU of Nebraska. He is a husband. He is a dog dad. He enjoys reading. He enjoys true crime. And his favorite movies are Mean Girls and Dodgeball. Here to tell his story, he calls the house guest, Mr. Ralph Kellogg.
I think so. All right. My mom, Barbara, or Barb, as she was known to friends and family, was a force of nature. My mom stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, weighed 125 pounds, depending on the day you ask her, had beautiful hazel eyes, and a mass of curly chestnut hair. My mom was bold and brassy, and she had a larger-than-life personality. My mom used to tell me that she knew she wasn't everyone's cup of tea, but that was okay by her because she was more of a coffee person. My mom raised me on her own. She divorced my dad when I was 13 months old after living for several years in an abusive relationship. And when I was old enough to begin asking her, "Mom, why don't I have a dad like other kids?" she would look at me and say, "I'll tell you about that when you're older." And when the questions got a little bit more intense along the lines of, "Mom, why don't I have brothers and sisters like my friends?" she would smile and she would look at me and she would say, "I figured out what caused you and I stopped." I learned what that meant when I was older too. Mom had a bad temper on her good days and a really bad temper on her bad days. Mom was bilingual. She spoke fluent trucker. And when she would get upset, she could string together a series of 4-letter expletives that were known for their poetic cadence in my neighborhood. Mom was a fixer and a doer and an overcomer. And when she wanted something to happen, it was going to happen. Her life was lived believing that you were either 100% with her or 100% against her. No exceptions. And I learned that very early on, too. In 1980, Mom was working as an auditor for the Missouri Department of Revenue. And on one of her audits, she ran across an invoice that said Card Construction based out of Rose City, Michigan. Now, this turned out to be a big fortuitous event because my mom had lost contact with her family over 2 decades prior due to a falling out that occurred between my mom's family and my dad shortly after she and my dad were married. So as she's looking at the invoice, she's thinking, well, what are the odds that I'm not related to the person in Rose City, Michigan? So she channels her best Jessica Fletcher. She picks up the phone, and sure enough, it was her uncle who owned Card Construction, and they got reacquainted on the phone. And during the phone call, she asked her uncle, I would love to find my dad. Do you know where my dad is? Because she had also lost contact with him during the episode that occurred a couple of decades prior. And he said, yeah, I know where your dad is. He's in Louisiana. I can get you his phone number and his address. Well, she reached out to her dad, George, who was in fact living in Louisiana. And after a series of phone calls and after a series of letters, the old-fashioned kind that you wrote and put in the mail, they decided it would be a great idea to have a reunion. And so that Thanksgiving, my uncle, my mom, and me, we drove down to Louisiana to meet her dad, George. Now, the reunion didn't necessarily take on the hallmark moment that I think my mom was looking for. George lived in a garage, and I don't mean a refurbished garage. I mean a garage. And when you walked into the living space, you were immediately confronted with dirt, and a sheen of dirt and grease was over all of the surfaces in the living area. You touched it and you picked up the debris. There was a table, a cooktop, and a sink and a small refrigerator in his living space. And it was clear on first sight that George was a hoarder. There were newspapers, there were magazines, there were old puzzle books, there was clothes, there were motor parts, there were tools lying all over the space. And in the corners of the residence or of the living space, there were large cobwebs with spiders I swear to this day were big enough to saddle and ride. These things were huge. There were tiny little bug corpses on the cooktop, and in true Addams-style family, there was fly strips hanging from the ceiling with tiny little corpses that decorated the fly strips. It was a sight. But beyond the physical appearance of George's living space was the smell. It was a combination of old man stew and clothes and garbage and just this musty smell. But under this baseline smell, I kept smelling wintergreen or spearmint or something, and I couldn't place it. And I was looking for air freshener and candies, and I couldn't place where the smell was coming from. And it was about that time that George picked up a cup that was on the table between us, and he spit in it. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and he must have seen the look of disgust registered on my face, and he said, "Oh, don't mind that. That's my spit cup." I didn't know what a spit cup was. He did it a few more times, and as I'm watching him, I see the brown liquid come out of his mouth, and I thought, oh, that's tobacco juice. That's what I'm smelling. It's good old wintergreen tobacco juice. After this get-to-know-you session was over, we decided that we would take George out to dinner, and we brought him back, we dropped him off, and we headed back to Kansas City, and I thought that's the last time I will ever see George. Well, a few weeks later, my mom shares some good news with me that she has invited George to come and live with us. George is going to live in the downstairs apartment that my mom sometimes rented out, and she was going to go pick him up after the first of the year. I knew there was no point in objecting, there was no point in protesting, and I said to myself, and I said to her, well, how bad could this be? I had no idea how bad it was going to be. So after the first of the year, my mom drove down, George came back, and she not only brought George, but she brought part of his hoard and his smell. George lived and moved into our downstairs basement. And what I believed was circumstance in the way that he lived was really George's choice. George didn't want to bathe because, according to him, he didn't do much of anything to sweat or get dirty. And he didn't want anyone washing his clothes, and he refused to wash his clothes himself. And so the times that my mom would wash his clothes, it would turn into this big tension-filled drama within the house, and it was awful. And he and I got along like oil and water. We did not mix. He would say things to me under his breath, around me, about me. Usually when my mom wasn't around, you just got the vibe that he didn't like me, and I certainly didn't like him. And I began to rely on what I always rely on and what's gotten me through my life. And I think it developed early on, and that was humor. I couldn't do anything about the fact that George was living with us, but I would find a way to protest. And so my first action was to give George a nickname. And the nickname that I gave George was Chud. And Chud stood for Cannibalistic Humanoid Underground Dweller. I felt like it fit. And so that's what I began to refer to George as in conversation. That was my way of protesting that I didn't like him living with us. Spring and summer rolled around, and George began to take residence on our front porch, wearing multiple layers of clothing, and the smell that emanated from him was overwhelming. And he would work his puzzle books on our front porch. And every once in a while, about 15 minutes or so, he'd set the puzzle book down, he'd open the front door, he'd spit out into the yard. Our front yard was now George's spit cup, and my mom's flower garden never stood a chance. My mom always had traditions and customs that she readily made sure that were followed within the house. And one of the things that she absolutely insisted on were the way that we spent Sundays. It was always church in the morning and dinner after church. And there was just no getting out of it. And so I had become accustomed to this time with her. It was just wonderful family time. And I loved my mom's Sunday dinners. She would make things like meatloaf or roast or steaks on the grill in the summer. But normally what we had for Sunday dinner was fried chicken with mashed potatoes and all the trimmings. And then afterwards, she would always have some sort of dessert, a cake or a grape pie or a fruit cobbler. It was just wonderful time. And so my uncle would typically come over for Sunday dinner. And one afternoon, we were all gathering around the table to eat dinner. My uncle was not one to stand on ceremony where dinner was concerned. He would typically come to the table shirtless with his best Daisy Duke jeans on. So it was a sight. So as we're sitting around the table, we're filling our plates. I'm putting food on my plate. They're all putting food on their plate. And we begin to eat. And I was eating the potatoes and eating the chicken. And after I took a few bites, my uncle looks over at me and says, "You know what you're eating?" Now, the one thing you never want to hear after you're chewing or have swallowed a lot of food is, "You know what you're eating?" And I said, "No." And he said, "That's squirrel. George and I went out and caught a mess of squirrel today. You're eating squirrel." I was eating squirrel. And my mom, cup half full person that she is, says, "But I made gravy out of the pan drippings." I've just eaten Bullwinkle's best friend. Pan drippings are not going to make this situation better. It's just not going to help. So that was Sunday dinner with George, as I like to call it. A few months after that would be the tipping point of our relationship and my mom's relationship with George. We had 3 dogs at the time that George was living with us. And one Sunday afternoon, I was in the front part of the house and the dogs were in the backyard. I hear this blood-curdling scream come from the backyard, and I race around, and One of the larger dogs has our very frail elderly schnauzer in its mouth, thrashing it about. And I was horrified looking at this. And as I'm taking this in, I'm looking at George, who is in the backyard, and he's standing there. He's just standing there letting this happen. I went over, I broke the dogs up, I brought the schnauzer inside. It was a case of it being worse than it actually, or sounding worse than it actually was. I cleaned her up, and I thought, that's it. I'm done. He's gonna go. And so a couple of weeks later, I went to my mom and I said that George was saying things to the neighbors about how my mom treated him, that she worked him like he was essentially hired help, and that he was essentially furniture that could be moved and used in whatever way that she wanted to. And she called George in and she made me repeat the story. The lie. And she told him, as her eyes filled with tears, that he would have to go. And so it wasn't long after that she found George an apartment close by, and that she got him moved in and got him situated, always made sure he had food, always made sure that his bills were paid and he had medications and he went to the doctor. But the relationship was never the same, because she looked at him leaving as a failure, as her failure. About a year and a half after George moved out of our house, he passed away from cancer. And as devastated as my mom was, I was devastated for her, but not for the fact that George had died. And I always kept thinking in my mind, there will be time in life when I can tell her what I did and why I did it, and she'll understand. And I justified it in my own way. He didn't like me. He's fine. It all worked out in the end. And it's amazing what you can tell yourself in those kinds of moments. In 2019, I would see my mom for the last time. She lived in Mission, Texas by this point, and she was coming to the end of her journey with Alzheimer's disease. And when I went to visit her, I remember tucking a bib into the top of her sweatshirt that she was wearing and feeding her and thinking, okay, Ralph, this is the time. You can tell her now. It's okay, tell her now. Until I remembered, she doesn't know who I am. She doesn't even know where she is. And telling her now would only serve to assuage my guilt. It wouldn't do any good. And it was in that moment that I realized that the forgiveness that I was searching for would have to come from myself. It's 2022, and I'm still working on that. When I think about my mom and the lesson that I always search for when situations like this occur in life, what am I supposed to take away from it? What am I supposed to gain? What knowledge am I supposed to have given to me? How do I become a better person? The whole Buddha myth of how you self-evolve. What lessons can I take? I always thought, well, maybe it's love. Well, maybe it's trust. Maybe it's honesty because I lied. Maybe it's respect. But then I always came back to the word hope, because hope is what filled my mom to leave an abusive relationship with the knowledge that something outside of where she was awaited. Hope is what allowed my mom to achieve all that she did during the course of her life, which was tremendous. Hope was the foundation that she used to forge a relationship with her dad. She just didn't count on me gumming up the works. I don't know where my mom is. I don't know if she's in heaven. I don't know if her spirit is with us tonight. But my hope for my mom is that she found the love and the joy and the acceptance that so often eluded her in this life. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph. Our next storyteller is a former photojournalist who now performs ultrasounds at Omaha's OBGYN. She tells me that about a decade ago, a very nice man taught her the country two-step, and now they have 2 beautiful children together. She enjoys baking, swimming, biking, storytelling, and she's very excited to be with us here tonight. We're very excited to have her here with her story, At the Bar, Teresa Prince Conway.
I think so. My body produced life itself in the form of a beautiful baby girl. And then 17 short months later, I did it again. This time, an adorable little boy, Josie and Eric. And let me tell you, having 2 kids under the age of 2, it is the best of times, and it is the worst of times. We've spent so many hours just cuddling together on the couch. I changed countless diapers and spit upon onesies. I loved how any little thing could make their eyes light up in wonder and joy. I hated how any little thing could make them cry inconsolably. My love for them was endless. Their needs from me also seemed endless. And one day I looked up and I realized that though I had never managed to sleep through the night or drink a hot cup of coffee, I had raised babies and they were now toddlers. And I still felt like a brand new mom. I had just spent so much time gestating and then lactating and then gestating and then lactating again. And now my son was walking on his own 2 feet and eating solid foods and just didn't need me like that anyway. It was like my body had been in their service and now it was mine again and I didn't know what to do with it. And it wasn't a weight thing. Like, I know I'm a skinny bitch, but still things they had settled and they had shifted in ways that I had not come to terms with. And so I decided to face this existential crisis head on, and I resolved to heal my mind-body connection through the art of dance. And I signed up for an adult hip-hop class at the Jewish Community Center, as one does. Now, it turns out that's not a popular class. In fact, it was canceled due to lack of interest. But no one offered to refund my money, so I called them up, and they said, oh yeah, of course we could give you your money back, or why don't you take one of our other classes? Do you know any ballet? And I said, yeah, I studied in college, which was technically true. I took a 1-credit-hour elective called Intro to Ballet. And they said, great, we have a ballet class on Wednesday evenings. And I said, sure, why not? Let's do this. And I show up for the first week of class. My husband's out of town, so I got a sitter, and I'm all excited. I get there early, I'm stretching. She assured me that I didn't have to buy anything. So I just came in my favorite yoga pants, my pretty tank, and I was ready to go. I wanted to learn new things, and I was really hoping that maybe, just maybe, I might make a new mom friend. Well, the other students file in. There's 3 of them. They're wearing black tights, or they're wearing pink tights and black leotards and braces. And the oldest one is 15 years old. This is when I go over to the old corkboard and I realize that this is not an adult ballet class. This is an advanced ballet class. And I'm not sure I'm supposed to be here. But I got a sitter and I'm not going home early. So I go up to the bar and I decide to give this my best shot. And we start warming up, and that's fine. The first thing is pliés. I can do that. Though as I'm doing that, I look over in the mirror and I realize I'm about as far from hip hop as you can possibly be. Because in ballet, this, absolutely verboten. In ballet, you tuck your tailbone underneath, you make your ass look as flat as it possibly can, and you drop it like a cold slab of marble. So we finish pliés, and then things get really tricky. There's tendus and like rondageons and flambés, and the teacher is just giving us all these terms, and she's mostly speaking French, and we have to remember our legs and our arms, and first and second and fifth. And all these tweens will just listen to her rattle off these instructions and then say, okay. And then they do it, and they look beautiful. And I am just staring in the mirror, trying to follow along. And after about 45 minutes, she goes, okay, ladies, good work. Turn away from the bar and just fall into your splits. And they all do. And I'm just hovering a foot above the ground, trying not to grunt too audibly. And now she says, ladies, it's time to really dance. Go to the corner of the room, and I want you to tombe, pas de mouret, double pirouette, repeat, and go. And I know a pirouette's a turn, but I can't do one. Definitely not a double. And I just like lurch my way across the stage, and I'm feeling super awkward and defeated and like, what am I doing here? We get to the last 10 minutes of class, and she says, okay, ladies, time to jump. And I go, oh, okay. So I stay in one spot. I plie down, spring up, land, repeat. Okay, that I can do. So we do 8, and then she asks for 8 more, and I do 8 more, and then she asks for more. And then I look over at these little tweens, and I notice something amazing. They're tired. Their lithe little legs are showing weakness. And these thighs still got power. So she says higher, and I go higher. She says more, I give her more. And when I land, I definitely pee my pants a little because I had 2 babies. But I'm not wearing the pink tights, so no one can tell. We're all good. And then she says, good job, ladies. And all those little tweens get together in their little gaggle, and they're talking, and they look over at me, and they turn, and they say, you did so good. You're coming back next week, right? How could you say no to that? I couldn't. I came back every week for 14 weeks. And I could almost do the splits at the end of that. And I could do a passable single pirouette. And more than anything else, I loved my body and all the graceful things that it could do. So, thank you.
Woo. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, that's funny. Our next storyteller moved to Omaha in 1992, and he enjoys reading mysteries. He enjoys classic rock and travel. In fact, he's the founder of the blog Chris's Corner, which is a regional theater and travel blog. He has, to this date, reviewed, I believe, 70 bed and breakfasts. So yeah, he really loves to travel, travels internationally too. We're very excited to have him here tonight with a story he calls Devastation. Please welcome Mr. Chris Elston.
Thanks. Good evening, everyone. You know, for all of my stories of theater, this one has always been the toughest to share. The year was 2002. And I finally had my chance to audition for my dream role of John Merrick in The Elephant Man. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the play, it's based off the true life story of a savagely disfigured Englishman who overcame his tragic circumstances to become the toast of London society. You know, due to my own bullied childhood, I've always had a strong affinity towards stories about the strength of the human spirit. So it was little wonder that I'd be pulled to a role like Merrick, whom I'd always respected for his courage and his perseverance. And I knew that if I ever had my chance, that I could truly prove my worth as an actor. Now, the last few years had not been good ones for me. I'd battled situational depression for over 2 years due to being stuck in an abusive dead-end job at the height of the Great Recession without any hope of escape in sight. And this depression robbed me not only of my happiness, but my theatrical confidence as well. But when I learned about the Playhouse's imminent production of The Elephant Man, I felt something that I hadn't felt in years: hope. And now that I finally had something to fight for, I went at it for all I was worth. Now, I felt I had a few advantages going into the audition. I was intimately familiar with Merrick's character and life story, and I was well acquainted with his physicality from having studied him over the years. But when I learned that Kevin Lawler was going to be directing the production, I felt I had yet another edge. Now, Kevin was one of the founders of this very theater, but he'd also guest directed a few shows at Creighton back when I was a student, and due to his laid-back auditioning style and his staunch belief that he could get the actor out of anyone, I had one of my very best college auditions under him. So that made me think I'd be heading into this audition on absolutely equal footing with everyone else. Now, each time I practiced, I remembered what happiness was just a little bit more, and the most wonderful thing began to happen. I started to get well. Slowly but surely, I was pulling myself out of that morass of misery I'd been mired in for so long. Now, I took the role as far as I could get it on my own, and then I took it one step farther when a friend got together with me the day before the audition, and together we went through everything I'd done, threw it away, and we started again from scratch. And by the time we finished, I knew we had created something magical, and I felt razor sharp and ready. Audition night. Never had I been so nervous for an audition. I'd brought a cane with me so I could feel a bit more like Merrick, and I wanted to be one of the first readers so I could set the bar to impossible heights. Now, when I picked up the sides for the audition, I realized two things immediately. One, because they were all monologues, I knew this was going to be a one-on-one audition, which I preferred due to their more relaxed and free nature. And two, all of my work might have just gone up in smoke. You see, the monologues were for Treves, Merrick's doctor and friend, and Ross, Merrick's business manager. Due to his difficulties talking, Merrick himself has no lengthy monologues. Oh, what to do. I'll tell you this much. I was bound and determined to go down swinging, so I told myself, no worries, I'll just ask Kevin if I can show him my Merrick. Now, I got my wish, and I was the first guy called up to read. Kevin greeted me with a smile and a handshake and said, I think I remember this guy. And for me, that was another jab of confidence because he was remembering me from an audition that had taken place 4 years prior. As we walked into the theater, Kevin complimented me on my cane, and I seized the moment to explain why I had brought it and to ask if I could show him my Merrick. He said we might be able to do that, but he wanted me to try this first. So he had me read Treves' monologue. And in this scene, Treves is trying to explain to Bishop Howe as to how guilty he feels about making Merrick a freak again, albeit a high-class one. Now, I saw Treves was on the cusp of a nervous breakdown, so I attacked the monologue with a very impassioned desperation. Kevin waved me off halfway through and said, I want you to try something for me. Take a seat. I want you to pretend you're in a bar drinking and are telling me this story. Don't be so earnest, but more like, this is bullshit and that's bullshit and my life is a lie and I don't want to see any anger. Well, for me, this was redemption time, because I'd been in the exact same scenario with him 4 years prior, and I shot myself in the face due to my inability to make a good change. I made a few mental adjustments, and then I took that monologue and I turned it inwards, and it was 10 times stronger as a result. I mean, the monologue just carried so much more weight and gravitas as I sat there quietly shaming myself. And when I finished, Kevin said, that was much better. Good changes. And then he allowed me to read for Merrick. He helped me read a scene where Merrick has a final confrontation with Ross, and I fell into the role and I proceeded to give what I still consider to this very day to be the single best audition I've ever given. I mean, I was lost in the role, I was brave and bold, I was hitting everything exactly the way I wanted to hit it, and it had the full power of my heart behind it. As I finished Merrick's best lines in the scene, I waited for Kevin to feed me the next cue, and I heard nothing. After a beat, I looked over at him, and I saw him just gazing at me intently, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Kevin, I said after a moment, and that seemed to snap him out of his reverie. And he said, well, you've certainly been studying photographs. You've got a good grip on his infirmities. Kevin then asked me if I'd read the play. I had to admit that I had, which led to me explaining why I felt such a strong connection with the character. Kevin processed that for a moment, and then he said he had one more task for me. He wanted me to read Ross's monologue, and he told me that if it helped, Ross was a very oily individual. So I went out into the hall, did a little mental homework, came back in, and fired my bolt. and I gave a very decent accounting of myself. I didn't think the read was quite as strong as my other two had been, but it was still very, very solid and in no way damaged the other work I'd done. More importantly, Kevin himself seemed to like it. For when I finished, he said, "That was just what I wanted to see, something completely different." He then told me he had to have the show cast by August 1st, and if I didn't hear anything by then, it unfortunately meant I hadn't been cast. He walked me to the door, thanked me for my time, and clapped me on the back. And as he did, I suddenly got a chill down my spine, just a momentary sensation that I was not going to be cast in the show. But I shoved it aside, chalked it up to nerves, and I left, fully confident that I'd left everything on the stage and that I did have a real chance at the role. Now, every day for the next 3 weeks, I dove at my phone every time it rang, hoping that it would be the call. And every day that passed without my getting the call caused my spirits to sink a bit. But by the same token, every day that passed without a formal rejection raised my hopes a bit. So at the end of 3 weeks, I was this very strange combination of nervous exhaustion and giddy hopefulness. And then July 31st rolled around. On that day, I had a letter waiting for me from the Playhouse, and I went cold. Inside were the all too familiar words thanking me for my time, but I had not been cast in The Elephant Man. I went to my bedroom, and I buried my face in my hands. I was struck so numb that I couldn't even cry. The only thought banging around in my head was this had been it. This had been my very best audition, and it failed. What did that mean about any audition I'd ever done or ever would do? It was almost as if I had gambled my entire theatrical future on this one shot, and I lost. For the first time ever, I looked into a mirror, and I truly believed that I had to be an awful actor. I didn't know what to do. You know, there's an unwritten rule in theater that says you never ask why you didn't get cast, and I completely agree with that rule because there's just too many uncontrollable factors outside of acting that dictate whether or not you get a part. Now, for myself, I didn't need to know why I didn't get cast. I just needed to know that what I had done meant something, that what I had given had value to someone other than myself, and that I hadn't been deluding myself the entire time. I wrestled with the decision for a few hours, but I finally sat down and I wrote Kevin an email. I thanked him for the opportunity. I asked if I'd been in the running, and I asked what he truly thought of the audition, and I sent it. Now, to be honest with you, I never expected to hear a reply. I had just felt better about doing something proactive. But a month later, he did reply, and I've never forgotten it. Dear Chris, yes, you were in the running. I was moved by the preparation you had done. I also thought you had done some good work in your preparations, but it worried me that you had done so much work on it. I wasn't quite sure what the breathing room would be. It was almost as if you had worked so hard that there might be little room for change or to begin from scratch, even if that's what was called for. What I was more concerned about seeing was how versatile an actor you were, where your qualities lay in the cold readings. Having said all that, I must tell you that it was one of the most wonderful displays of heart and care that I've ever come across from an actor in an audition. I thank you for that. I am sorry that it didn't work out this time, but I think you should and will keep auditioning if you love theater as much as it seems you do. Many thanks, Chris. Kevin. What mixed feelings I had. I was deeply touched by Kevin's words, but that was countered by the horror that the things I had done to give myself the best possible chance had destroyed them. Plus, there was my own personal burden of knowledge of knowing that there hadn't been anything to fear on the directing front. For if nothing else, the audition I'd given him was almost as new to me as it was to him. Still, I was very glad to have his words to lean upon, because that audition haunted me for a long, long time. But eventually I saw the great gifts that I actually got from that audition. First and foremost, I truly believe God sent me that audition not to play John Merrick, but because preparing for the role is what pulled me out of the depression I'd been fighting for such a long time. It was also inspiring. Instead of believing I could never again match what I gave that night, I vowed to get all my auditions up to that level. And thanks to Kevin's words, I now knew I'd gotten close. I'd gotten very, very close. And my final thought on the matter was that Kevin made the right call. in the sense that if I wasn't going to get to play John Merrick, it truly was better not to be in the show at all at that point. For although I was free of the depression, my theatrical confidence was still somewhere below the basement. And if I'd taken another role and watched the magic work by the actor who did play Merrick, I would have convinced myself that I could never have matched it and just quietly walked away from the business. Nowadays, I look back on that audition, and I am truly grateful for the gifts that it brought me. And I'm very proud of the work I did with it. And there was so much for me to be proud of. Thank you, everyone. God bless.
Last summer, when I was collecting stories for this event, I got to thinking about the different forms of storytelling: folk music, rap, spoken word poetry, and how we might be able to include some of them at a musing event. And so a college friend put me in touch with Matt Mason, who is Nebraska's poet laureate. And he was gracious enough to put the feelers out to some of his colleagues to see if any of them would be interested in participating. And about a day later, Mexican-American poet and storyteller Fernando Antonio Montejano answered the call. And so we sat down for coffee together, and I explained to him that what I was really looking for was to have a new piece of work to premiere at tonight's event. And he told me that he already had a work in progress. He already had something he'd been working on for an upcoming event, Dia de Muertos 2022, which is a celebration of the lives of those that we've lost. And so it's my honor tonight to have Fernando here with us. And he's going to be premiering a piece that he wrote for his late sister, Bianca. Please welcome Fernando Antonio Montejano.
Perfect. Oh gosh, thank you. This is Bianca. On July 11th, late in the evening as dusk settled over the desert mountains that paint El Paso's horizons, my mom found my little sister Bianca on the bathroom floor as she turned blue from an overdose. The next day, my older sister Vanessa would call and let me know. Suddenly, I'd find myself in the midst of grief come calmly, the gentle hand of death guiding me home to forget my memories. Bianca was 27. Her birthday was June 2nd, and I forgot to say happy birthday to her this year. Busy, I guess. I haven't seen my sister in 12 years, but really, if we're speaking literally, it's been every day on her stories on Instagram and Facebook. I talk to her a lot, but definitely not as much as the other people around me. Not as much as the people grieving in my family. On July 14th, I'm stepping off of a Greyhound after a little over 24 hours of bus delays and broken AC, and got a bathroom that was indoors that they have to know was a bad design choice. I set my first foot in El Paso after 12 years, and it feels the same as every other step on any other day. The emotions are numb, but the senses feel. No humidity. Omaha's so humid. The wind is thick with everyone else's breath snagged on the sticky air where they left it, but the breeze here just flows. It isn't fighting through heat. It is cool, and the sun is dry, and I am a fat guy who normally hates hot days, but I'm standing here with my arms wide open in the middle of this parking lot like an idiot, taking in the same sun that kissed you, Bianca. I see a white car with familiar faces churn into the parking lot, my mom and my aunt and Bianca's daughter. The last time I saw Bianca, she had just turned 15. Truth be told, I only remember her face because I took a picture of it when I was there last, and more truth, the years of addiction did not spare the things I cared about. The only reason I have that picture is because I posted it to Instagram, and it's still there. A candid picture of my sister. Even before then, I hadn't seen Bianca in almost another decade, so the only face of hers I remembered was the one I spent the most time with, the bouncy little sister I had who was so goddamn goofy you'd think she came right out of a cartoon. Even though I saw her on social all the time, even though I knew in my brain that my little sister had grown up, the trauma brain clung on to the face I knew best. The one I sat beside as we were wrapped in duct tape and left to suffocate. Were abused physically, sexually, tortured. We did it together. Bianca, Vanessa, and me. Until I was old enough for those walls in my mind to start coming down on their own, I only remembered a few of the bad things. The rest was like random flashes of brown skin and white teeth and tears and smiles and shouting, and it all sounded chaotic and overwhelming, like the static of every memory I suppressed, reminding me that I can't forget forever. But therapy helped. Talking to Bianca about the past helped some too. I always wondered who else she told, though. Or if these were secrets we kept for each other, a way to feel close when we couldn't be there, to chase demons away with something other than empty bottles. Those secrets that often go untold to spare the ones who love us most, not because we think they're incapable of helping us. I mean, I guess, yeah, we do, but because we bear the burden of sorrow, so no one else has to. We hold it like a lamp to lead the rest of our friends and family through their own darkness. Even if we walk through that light with vices like poltergeists making broken homes of our good bones. Coming home after so long, I found myself lost not in memories, but instead in the idea that I was in the wrong place. I realized that the half of Bianca I knew was not the strongest half. It was just the only half I'd ever talked with the only face of hers I could remember. So, when I sat down in the back seat with Aria, my niece, the dreamlike numbness that held me on the bus here gripped me tighter. She looked just like her mom when she was young, when I knew her. And even though there was an entire back seat for her to spread out on, she felt compelled to plant herself right in the very center. And because she was so close, the only thing that I could think to say was, "I'm sorry if I smell." I think I didn't cry because I had nothing in me left to give. I was wearing most of my tears as sweat from the bus. The tears themselves were thriving on one bottle of water I made last for the whole trip there, and I hadn't eaten anything but spoonfuls of peanut butter since a few days before I left for Texas, so my body couldn't weep, but it ached. My body ached, and I tried to sit comfortably in the back seat while my aunt and my mom drove me home. I tried to settle into this place, those faces slowly bringing back all of the things I'd forgotten. The streets were singing my sister's name. And as I waited for Vanessa to arrive within the next day or two, I braced myself for what would come to pass while I was home. Bianca brought us all back here. Brought us together, but we didn't realize how much she was the light we needed when things were at their darkest. The thing is, we didn't discover that in a way you'd expect. At this point, the idea in your head is maybe that the entire trip was melancholy, hard, devastating, and to some extent, you'd be right. Absolutely, it was. It was devastating and re-traumatizing. It was depressing, and I felt an emptiness I can hardly describe in words. A feeling that maybe doesn't exist in human language. Yet somehow, within the deepest and most haunting corners of this return, within the winding streets of my hometown and the ghosts that lingered on the corners of those old neighborhoods, there was this feeling of closeness. El Paso was home. Maybe still is. This is where Bianca grew up. It's the only home she knew. Within that thought was the reminder that as much as I was able, I needed to find the good in my time there. Needed to be who my sister was, not the side of her I knew, but the person I never got to know. The Bianca that my family raved over, that made her sound like she was someone not of this world. So I decided that each day I spent with my family and her friends would be filled with stories. On the days when my grief wasn't overwhelming me, I wanted to know everything they knew. And as I listened, I watched their faces ignite. The way they talked about my little sister felt like they were telling stories about someone who never existed, who couldn't have existed, someone who was too pure for this world. And when Vanessa finally got to El Paso, the stories came pouring in. Vanessa and I exist on two different sides of this line of trauma, where her trauma and life experiences sharpened her memories. Mine were wiped away. But Vanessa, oh man, she had a picture-perfect memory. From the worst to the best, she was capable of almost complete recall of the things we lived together. So she would paint these pictures for my brain that almost threw me backwards into the past, seeing my grandma's front yard, the tall black iron gates that made our poor little home feel regal, the fruit trees and the grass, maybe peach or apple. It didn't matter. They weren't dainty fruit trees to us. They were a rainforest as we trekked beneath a humid and lush canopy. The world, when we were younger, was full of adventure. Not just growing up before the internet would take over and before everyone would have cell phones in their hand, but also growing up poor. All three of us spent our time imagining something better. With a past like ours, though, could you blame us for telling stories and finding ways to make that a reality? When you grow up with trauma like we did, you sometimes make your way through this world both in and out of reality. Hyper aware of everything, but just broken enough to be able to forget it all at the snap of a finger. The useful side of disassociation. The side that helped you tune out the abuse of your siblings until your turn came. The side that helps you numb yourself to other people's hands no matter how much you love them. But despite that, despite the years of pretending, forgetting, and remembering, we somehow managed to find joy. Maybe because things got so dark sometimes, and in those moments of utter darkness, the only things you are capable of seeing are the glimmers of light. Those faint strands of light glowing in the distance, drawing you on to something better. We may have been grieving or avoiding grieving or pretending we'd already grieved. But Vanessa and I still found things to laugh at. Every once in a while, it was a story about me crying and her bullying me because she was the older sister. That was fun. But usually it was about Bianca. That sound of her goofy laughter, the voices she would break into randomly, her generous nature, her style, her heart, her. Vanessa told me a lot of stories, but there was one that stood out to me, one that was confirmed by my mother and the rest of my cousins who happened to be there, and that was told to me multiple times by a lot of people. We were having a conversation about how generous Bianca was, because she hated seeing anyone go without. Well, one day, during a point in time when there wasn't a lot of extra money in the household, Bianca went off to some amateur night at a strip club. She did her thing and came back with a stack of money, and the first thing that she did as she walked in that door was went right up to each person that happened to be in the house and handed them cash. This was a story that multiple people told me about. And I know to some it's probably weird to bring up a story about how my dead sister went and stripped for some extra cash, but these are circumstances that are normal for some people. The point here is that Bianca was the kind of person to do more for others, often without being asked. And it didn't matter what she had to do to make it happen. I'm telling you, the stuff that people told me had my jaw on the floor, had me rolling with laughter, had me crying. One friend told me about how she needed help, how they needed help, and she found out about it too late and got very upset with them for not asking. So she knew this person very well, good friend. She drove to where they were going to be that day, saw them on the street, took a wad of cash, threw it at them, and drove away. Because Bianca knew that this person was the type of friend that wouldn't accept the money otherwise. She was the type who returned favors even if someone insisted that she didn't owe them. She would sing during arguments. If friends or family were fighting, she instantly made herself the mediator. She hated seeing people upset. She treated her friends like family. She treated her friends' families like family. She forced people to try new things. She insisted everyone get out of their comfort zones and do the things that scare them, not because she needed someone to be adventurous with, but because she wanted to see the people she loved bloom, become versions of themselves that only Bianca could see. I remember someone told me that she loved everyone at their worst. And I remember wondering what that looked like. And then a day or so later, someone told me another story about her. The neighbors who lived in the apartment next to my mom, they were great people. They were great people who often helped when things were getting hectic. They were there the night that she passed. And they knew her pretty well. In fact, it was the husband who told me this story the one night that I got to talk to him. He said that about a year ago, he had to leave home and his wife, things weren't going so well. He and his wife have kids, so they worked things out. They talked. Unfortunately, word got around, and everyone looked at him different, judged him. He cheated. So, naturally, he was really worried about coming back. He was worried that as soon as he got home, somebody would be there to kick him out again. As he's walking up to the door, getting ready to undo the lock, he's got his key in his hand, he sees Bianca there. Mind you, it was about 3 a.m. She was out there smoking a cigarette. She was a night owl for sure. And he was so worried that she was going to judge him or give him a nasty look or cuss him out. So he prepares for the worst. Looks her in the eye and says hello. Without missing a beat, she looked at him, smiled softly, and said, "Welcome back." He told me it meant a lot to him. Something he'll keep with him as a memento of who she was, not just to him, but who she was in general. Because Bianca just cared about everyone. They said she would let people ramble on and on about the things that they loved. She genuinely loved hearing people be passionate and excited about their lives. She was thoughtful. She was the only person to send a letter to my sister Vanessa while she was in prison. She was such a pure person, you wonder maybe how someone like that loses their life to drugs. We all need something to help us cope. Vanessa and I did. We fell to addiction because it's in our blood. So I understand completely that feeling of wanting to escape. This isn't an instance where I have to sit and wonder why she turned to drugs, why she would go further and do harder and smoke longer and feel less, because I did too. And Vanessa did, and my mom did, and some of my family still do. But Bianca didn't do drugs the way we did. We were trying to numb the pain of memories burned into our brains, searing every single day of our lives. Bianca went through the same things we did and more. But she only turned to drugs once the pain became physical. I didn't mention it, but my sister had a lot of medical complications up to the end of her life. Her body was deteriorating and she was in constant pain. She had prescribed medications, but they didn't help. She smoked a little bit of weed, but it only helped so much. So in the end, when someone offered the opportunity at relief with something a bit stronger, it wasn't hard to say no. Even to a drug as daunting as fentanyl. Bianca wasn't an addict, though. She was just a person in pain. A beautiful person who had taken so many hits, a person who continued taking hits and despite that still put all the energy she had left into uplifting everyone around her, helping them see the most in themselves while she was fading away. So I could never fault her for turning to something she thought might help during one of the most difficult and painful periods of her life. I can't judge her, and I never would, because regardless of the things I learned about her, what I knew was already enough. Bianca was not just a light in life. She continues to be, even now. I know my family and I still are not over this. It's only been a few months, 3 to be exact. Yet even while we're crying, we're laughing because we find these new videos and pictures of her tucked away, and they're always of her being silly or just because she's trying to make somebody laugh, or they're of her being ridiculous because that was literally her natural state of existence, was just being ridiculous. I went to El Paso expecting that maybe it would make me forget about all of the things that had been weighing on me before I arrived there. Instead, I wound up remembering things I didn't really want to, but that I needed to. I found a family in this space that had not known me for over a decade and still welcomed me into every home as if I'd been there for years. A family that was broken, that hasn't spoken to each other in I don't know how long. But because of Bianca, they came together, and when I saw them again, it seemed like they had not missed a beat. They were smiling and laughing in exactly the way that I remember them from years ago. Some of my cousins were older, maybe a little more sadness in their eyes, but they showed up for her. And it's a little fucked up, but the most selfish part of me would still trade the family for Bianca, you know? I love who they are. And I love that they found some peace with each other, and in some cosmic way, it makes sense that it was Bianca who did it, who brought them together. But I love Bianca more than all of that. I do have to accept, though, that if she could see what she was able to do for the people she loved. She'd have said it was worth it. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. All right, well, our last storyteller for the evening is about to come on. She is a retired pediatrician. She has 3 grown sons and 2 lovely daughters-in-law. She enjoys hiking. She enjoys playing bridge, swimming, traveling. And here she is to tell us a wonderful story that she calls Matchmakers Can Appear in the Most Unexpected Places. Sara Strattan.
I think so. Yeah, thank you. The most important letter in my life was written in the summer of 1979. It was a letter of introduction written by my great-aunt Belle to her newly found ophthalmologist, Dr. Donald Arkfeld. Dear Dr. Arkfeld, enclosed, $720.20. Medicare paid $442.08. Had your bookkeeper known the balance when I left, I would have paid it at that time. Hope to be able to read Wednesday 22 when I go for glasses to the exam. Did not have any trouble to find someone for the exam. I have a very charming niece, Sara Strattan, age 22, going to study medicine, the last report I had. She is the granddaughter of Ray McGrath and the niece of General Grunther. The following is double underlined. I have chosen her for your wife. Now, just for fun, if you are not already pinned, call her. 551-4404. I told her what a warm and charming person you are. Thank you for helping me to see better. Love, Belle. Well, Dr. Arkfeld, not wanting to offend a new patient, dialed 551-4404, and we were introduced. We went out a few times that summer, and I did not find him to be the warm and charming person described in this letter. So we went out a few times and ended our relationship, but Don did send me the letter as a keepsake, wrote a little note. Sara thought you might want this, Don, and it is really sweet. So I folded it up, I put it back in the envelope, and I put it in a box that I didn't open for 9 years. Little did I know at the time what an important piece of family history this letter would become. So I went to medical school, that's 4 years. I went away and did a pediatric residency, that's 3 years. And then I came back to Omaha to practice general pediatrics. About a year or so after I had returned to Omaha, I was in the parking garage at the hospital, and Don drove by in his big old car, rolled his window down, and asked me if I was married. And I said, no. And then he asked me out on a date. Now, I hesitated because in the past 8 years, he had gone out with quite a few young women who I knew. And not just 1 or 2 people, but several people had suggested that Don and I go out on a date. And I'm like, did that, not interested. But for some reason, I accepted his invitation. And about a week later, he took me to a little restaurant north of Omaha called the Surfside Club. It's on the Missouri River. They serve really good catfish, fried chicken, and hush puppies, especially if you slather them with honey. So we were having this great meal, sitting on the picnic tables outside, watching the boats go up and down the river and slapping at those mosquitoes, and having a fabulous conversation. And I looked across the table at that man, and I realized at that moment, this is the guy, this is the man I've been praying for that would walk into my life. and I started to fall in love with him. I knew that I was going to marry him. So we dated that summer and really had a wonderful, wonderful time. And I thought things were going quite well, but I should have seen it as a sign. When Don was planning his 40th birthday party and he told me all about it, and he never sent me an invitation. And his birthday came and went, no invitation in my mailbox. And quite honestly, it really hurt my feelings. And shortly after that, he broke it off. And I was devastated because I was in love with the guy. I thought we were going to get married, but that didn't happen. So just pick up, life goes on. I was really busy with work, I was traveling, and I just made the best of things. Several months later, it was on St. Patrick's Day. Again, the setting was the hospital, this time the medical records department. You used to have to go sign charts. Things are different now. But we were both down there completing our medical records, and he asked me out. And of course, I said, yes, yes, yes. And this time, over the ensuing months, he gave into his feelings for me and did ask me to marry him. And I was packing to get ready to move in, and I came across this box that I hadn't opened for 9 years. And I came across that letter Aunt Belle had written. And I had forgotten, she said, I have chosen for you your wife. So Aunt Belle was still alive, and of course she was invited to the wedding, and we read the letter at the rehearsal dinner, and it was just really a wonderful celebration. About a year later, I was expecting our first child. We had shared the happy news with our parents, and I called my grandma to tell her, and this is Aunt Belle's sister, and my grandmother says to me, well, I already know. And I said, did Dad tell you? She said, oh, no. Aunt Belle had a vision that Don and I were expecting a baby. And in fact, we were, and we had a little boy. And then we had another little boy a year and a half after that. And then we had another little boy about a year and a half after that. So in the space of about 3 years, we had 3 little kids. So Aunt Belle, she again kind of knew what was happening in our lives. Now, we were a really busy family. 3 kids, 2 working parents, but we loved to spend time with our kids. And one of our favorite things to do was to travel with them. And our favorite destination was the YMCA Camp of the Rockies in Estes Park. Every summer, we rented a cabin. We stayed up there. We would spend time outside watching for shooting stars. The kids went to day camp. We hiked. We rode horses. We did lots of crafts in the craft center. Family and friends would come to visit us. It was just really a wonderful time. We established routines as young families do. We tried to eat dinner together every night. We had a bedtime routine that involved stories, say prayers, and then we would sing songs and lullabies. Our favorite song to sing was a song from The Sound of Music, Edelweiss. Our very happy family life was changed drastically when Don was diagnosed with cancer when our oldest son was 6 years old. He had to have a bone marrow transplant, and this pretty much put an end to his medical career. But he was able to spend lots of great time with our kids and with me between hospitalizations, doctor's visits, clinic visits. He took the kids to school. He packed their lunches. He was the go-to guy if there was any sewing that needed to be done because he was a surgeon in the family, and that's not necessarily my forte. Don loved to bake. He was a chemistry major. And, if any of you have a chemistry major friend, they are really good in the kitchen because recipes are chemistry. But anyway, he loved to bake. And this was in the heyday of the bread machine. And some nights he couldn't sleep because of the medicine he was on, and he would stay up all night long baking bread. We would come out in the morning to the kitchen to the aroma of that lovely bread with those weird kind of shaped loaves. They were kind of, I don't know, they're really kind of weird shaped. Anyway, it was a great breakfast. We also had a really wonderful event for our family. The year was 2002. Don's cancer. We were just living with it, trying to fight it. But in 2002, it was the year the Olympic torch was coming through Omaha, and Don thought it would be cool to carry the torch. So we mentioned to our pastor, gee, I wish there was Make-A-Wish for adults. And he said, I'd love to carry that torch. Well, the sponsor of the Olympic torch run through Omaha, Father Mel, knew him. So they made arrangements for Don not to carry the torch because those spots were super coveted and hard to get. But Don was going to be able to ride in the truck that carried the flame from Council Bluffs to Omaha over the Missouri River. So we were delighted. The morning of the torch run, Don received a phone call from one of the organizers, and this woman asked Don if he wanted to carry the torch. And he said, well, I'm already riding in the truck. Didn't you know that? And she said, well, somebody heard your story, and they've given up their spot of actually carrying the torch. And so, of course, he said yes. And so we grabbed the kids out of school. We called all the relatives, parents, everybody, and we all traipsed over to Council Bluffs. Don got this really cool running suit, and he got the torch. And he got to carry the torch. It was about a 3 or 4 block kind of run down Broadway Street. They lit the flame at the top. The theme of the torch run that year was Light the Fire Within. And as I reflected back on that time, I realized that's what we were trying to do with our young family as we walked this really difficult journey with cancer. Unfortunately, Don was not going to be able to beat that cancer. It was an especially nasty one. On the last day of his life, he was in the hospital, and he was awake and talkative, and he was able to talk to each one of the boys alone and tell them how much he loved them. Throughout the day, people came and went from his room, family, friends, hospital staff. Everybody really loved Don. The day was going on. It was in the afternoon, and he was sleeping, and I was holding his hand. And Don and I never, ever gave up to the last breath, but I knew this was not looking good. And I can't even describe how sad I was, how empty I was. It was so hard. And I didn't know what to do. So I started to sing. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, every morning you greet me, small and white, clean and bright. You look happy to meet me. And I stopped. And the words caught in my throat, and I just couldn't go on. And then I heard from my sweet husband's lips, blossom of snow, may you bloom and grow forever. Edelweiss, Edelweiss, bless my homeland forever. And about an hour later, he passed away, and I had to let go of his precious hand. I will always be thankful to Dawn for that parting gift of singing our favorite lullaby together with me. Well, Aunt Belle was right. She knew a good match when she saw one, even though it took Dawn and me 8 or 9 years to figure it out. You never know where you're going to meet the love of your life. A matchmaker might come along in the most surprising way and in the most unexpected place. Everybody needs an Aunt Belle in their life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hey, can we just have a round of applause for all of tonight's storytellers? Sweethearts. Just wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us here tonight for the first of 2 events we'll be presenting this year from using a storytelling series. Our next event will be in April of 2023, and we hope you can join us then. Drive safely, and thank you again for joining us. Good night.